Welcome to AP lesson number 1 on setting up vendor types. I am currently in the AP Center. Now before we can enter vendors, we have to set up what are called vendor types. Now I'm assuming at this point that the general ledger chart of accounts is all set up, so we don't need to talk about that, but you will see we will be using that chart of accounts to set up vendor types. Now when we talk about vendor types, you might want to ask, well, what do you mean by vendor types? And what I usually say is when you take your pile of AP invoices and you put them into separate piles based on the types of vendors, you might have 4 or 5 major types of vendors. Your material supply vendors being your biggest group of vendors, maybe office supply vendors, truck supply vendors, like that. So what you can do in accounts payable to make it easier to run is that you can set up different vendor types. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Setup on the menu bar and click into Vendor Types. What vendor types do is they allow you to default the accounts for different groups of vendors. For example, your material supply vendors probably pretty basically use the same set of accounts, so that instead of having to set up those accounts for each of those supply vendors, they will be defaulted by the account set up with the vendor type. Another thing that you can do with vendor types is that you can pay your invoices by just saying, I want to pay just my material supply vendors to take advantage of discounts and things of that nature. So it allows you to limit your pay list, which is nothing more than a list of invoices that you need to pay, by different groups of vendors or vendor type. The third thing it allows you to do is to print out aging reports by type of vendor. So if you wanted to see what you owed to just your supply vendors, for example, you can do that kind of thing. So I'm in the vendor type setup window, and we're going to set up a couple of different vendor types. Now, it isn't essential that you have vendor type set up for every different type of vendor, other than material supply vendors. It's not necessary like to have a vendor type for telephone supply vendors, or maybe just have a generic one for utility vendors, like that. So I generally see a list of vendor types of being about maybe 4 or 5 different vendor types. So let's set a couple of them up. I'm going to click the New button, and Cobra takes me to the vendor type field itself, where I can enter a 1-character letter or number representing this vendor type. And as I hit enter, I'm brought to the vendor type description. Material suppliers, for example. And as I hit enter, I'm brought down to the first expense account field, and what you want to do is you want to select something in each one of these drop downs. So in the first expense account field, what I'm going to do is select either an inventory account or a material cost of goods sold account, and that really depends on if you're going to be running inventory through Cobra or not. If you buy directly for your jobs, then you could select a material cost of goods sold account. If you buy everything and run it through inventory first, you would select an inventory account here. Now the freight account, I would also suggest breaking out material supply invoices by freight and sales tax as well, because especially if you're going to run purchase orders, we know what to compare the pricing on. What was actually material as expense to this account versus how much of the invoice was freight and sales tax, because that can always overstate then the AP invoice against the purchase order. So I always suggest separating out material supply vendor invoices into a material or inventory account, a freight account, and your sales tax expense account. The other reason is in regards to sales tax. I hear over and over again all over the country that people get audited for sales tax. So by keeping track of how much of each invoice you paid on sales tax, you're presenting an auditor, for example, with all the information that they need, and chances are you won't have to pay more than you should if you do get audited on sales tax. Your AP account, there should only be one in your drop down there. Cash account, we'll select the cash account from all the different cash accounts in your general ledger. and then your discount account. So even if this vendor type is not going to be one for, say, a supply vendor, you do need to select something in all of these drop downs. So I'm going to save this, and if I didn't have something in all of these drop downs, it wouldn't let me save it. So I'm going to do that, and once I click OK there, it is displayed above in my list of vendor types. Now I can double click on it where it brings it down below, and I can change anything I want to. And keep in mind too that as you begin setting up vendors and you say that they're a material supply vendor, they will be set up with these accounts, but these accounts can be overwritten vendor by vendor and even on the invoice entry. So you're not limited to just these accounts for this vendor is my whole point. We're just trying to speed up the vendor entry later on. So let's set up another vendor type. I'm going to put O for office supplies. And I'm going to select my accounts here for office suppliers. From my drop down, if I don't know my accounts, I can drop it open. There's my office supplies expense account. And I might leave freight and sales tax alone there as well. Otherwise, I can use alternate expense accounts that I might put or expense and office supply vendors invoices to. But by and large, office supply vendors are similar to material supply vendors in that this is how they're broken out. So once I've done that, I don't have to resave these, so or reselect them, so I'll just save this vendor type, and there it is on my list. Now before I exit the screen, I have to tell Cobra, based on all these different vendor types that you might have set up here, which is my default one. And the default one just ensures that when you're setting up a new vendor that they are set up with a set of accounts initially, so you don't have to worry about it later on. And since the material suppliers is my biggest group of vendors, I'm going to click on the M1 here for material suppliers, and I'm going to click the default button at the bottom of the screen so that that M shows up down here under default vendor type. Now I'm ready to actually enter vendors. So I'll exit this screen. This ends the lesson on setting up AP vendor types.